Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. We start tonight with some rather jaw-dropping information about American politics that has been reported out by a British news source. It's the BBC. The BBC has just aired a new documentary based on Oval Office tapes, which proves something about the American presidency and American modern history that even the most conspiratorial among us would not be able to believe were it not all captured on tape. But apparently, it's all captured on tape. Here's what happened. Okay, it's about the 1968 presidential election. In that election, the Democratic side was kind of in trouble in that the Democratic electorate was really split. They were not at all unified behind their candidate. On the right, Southern white Democrats who were against civil rights, they were being peeled off to vote for George Wallace, the former Alabama governor and, of course, the symbol of proud segregation. So the Dixiecrats are getting peeled off from the Democrats that year. And also, different problem for the Democrats, people hated the Vietnam War. And the president at the time was a Democrat, Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ. The escalation in Vietnam was on him. So if you were against the war, as most Americans at that point were, this is the Gallup polling on the war at that time, this is the number of people who thought the war was a mistake, that number going up and up and up over time. If you were against the war, as increasingly everybody was, you were not psyched to vote for LBJ's successor in the Democratic Party. Right? So the Democrats were losing their appeal in the South because of race and racism, and they were losing the anti-war vote because Vietnam was their war. Well, the Republican candidate that year, trying to take advantage of that split on the Democratic side, was this handsome devil. Candidate Dick Nixon. Richard Nixon in 1968 was running against a Democratic Party that he knew was split. He was, in response, pledging to get rid of the draft. And he claimed to have a plan to end the war. He argued that if you wanted the war to end, you needed to elect him. You needed to vote the Democrats out of office because clearly LBJ and his party, the Democrats and their Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, they had no idea how to end the war. If you wanted the war to end, what you needed was Nixon. What you needed was total change at the White House. The Democrats had to go so Dick Nixon could come in and end Vietnam. But then, less than a week before the election, it all went horribly wrong for Richard Nixon. Because less than a week before the election, it was 5 nights before Election Day, on Halloween night, 1968, the Democratic president, LBJ, went on TV in a surprise, nationally televised address. He made a surprise announcement that peace was at hand. The communist side, the North Vietnamese side, was going to make major concessions at peace talks. The U.S. anticipating that the other side, the South Vietnamese, were going to agree to a deal based on those concessions. Peace was at hand. The terms were all set. Peace was at hand. In recognition of the fact that peace was about to be declared, the United States would step back right away and stop all military operations in Vietnam. LBJ said that on a Thursday night. The election was going to be the following Tuesday. Turns out the Democrats do know how to end this war that the country hated. So this was bad news for Richard Nixon for that election, right? Bad news for Richard Nixon, but good news for the country who wanted the war to be over. Good news certainly for the people who were fighting the war. This was good news, right? Almost. Thursday night, LBJ made that announcement that peace was about to be agreed to by all sides in Vietnam. That was Thursday night. By Saturday morning, never mind. Deal was off. Peace was not at hand because the South Vietnamese side had decided actually it didn't want the deal. In fact, they didn't even want to talk about a deal. They pulled out of the peace talks. And so the war was back on. What happened? What happened between Thursday and Saturday? Now we know.
Hello.
Good morning, Mr. President.
How are you, my friend?
Good about.
Well, I've got one this morning that's pretty rough for you. We have found that our friend, the Republican nominee, our California friend, has been playing on the outskirts with our enemies and our friends both. He's been doing it through rather subterranean sources here. And he has been saying to the Allies that you're going to get sold out. You better not give away your liberty just a few hours before I can preserve it for you. Mrs. Chenault is contacting their ambassador. Now, this is not guesswork. Yes, you know, she's young and attractive. I mean, she's a pretty good-looking girl. And she's around town. And she is warning them to not get pulled in on this Johnson move.
President Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1968, Saturday morning, November 1st, explaining to Senator Richard Russell what had gone wrong with this peace deal that everybody thought was going to end the war. I mean, LBJ had been so sure this is going to end the war that he went on TV Thursday night and told the country the war was going to end. Peace was at hand. The reason peace did not happen, what he was explaining on the phone, is that the Republican nominee for president that year, Richard Nixon, had intervened in the peace talks to blow them up. He used an intermediary who was involved in the talks to approach the South Vietnamese side and tell them, don't do it. Approach them and tell them to pull out and not agree to a deal. He told them this deal being worked out by LBJ, this whole deal to end the war, these peace talks in Paris, is not going to be a good deal for them. They should not participate. They should just wait until after the election when he, Richard Nixon, would be president and he'd give them a much better deal. Johnson was going to sell them out. He, Richard Nixon, was the one who they should deal with. Nixon's intermediary was actually caught on tape telling the South Vietnamese ambassador, just hang on through the election. Hang on, don't end the war. We need the war to keep going through the election. It's outrageous, right? I mean, the war could have ended. It was on the verge of ending, except a candidate for office in our country thought that the war ending would help his opponent in the election. He thought he'd have a better chance of getting elected if the war kept going. And so, while saying he wanted the war to end, he did what he could to keep it going when it otherwise would have ended. It is astonishing. And President Johnson thought so, too, at the time. We now know.
And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. I know. I think it would shock America if a principal candidate was playing with a source like this on a matter this important. Yeah.
President Lyndon Johnson there on the same day as that earlier tape, remarking that as far as he can tell, this is treason. I do not think he is saying that hyperbolically. He says it repeatedly on these tapes. He thinks that what has happened there, an American politician purposely prolonging the war and stopping the peace for his own purposes, he thinks that is a hanging offense. He thinks that is treason. This was 4 days before the election that year. Having thought that the war was going to be over, that a peace deal had been negotiated, now the president finds out the peace deal fell through because a candidate who wanted there not to be peace before the election intervened to make one side walk away. Now, why didn't LBJ say anything publicly? I mean, this is right before the election. Can you imagine how the country would have reacted to that? This is a war the whole country was against. It was going to be over, except candidate Dick Nixon intervened to undo the peace deal and keep the war going. Can you imagine how angry the American public would have been? But LBJ did not say anything publicly at the time because he thought that he couldn't. And the reason he thought he couldn't is because of the way he found out what Nixon had done. The FBI illegally wiretapped the phones of the South Vietnamese ambassador. That's how we knew. We couldn't let anybody know that we were illegally listening into the ambassador's phone lines, and so they couldn't let anybody know what it was they heard illegally while they were illegally listening in on the ambassador's phone lines. And so Nixon got away with it. And the October surprise, the Halloween night surprise that the Democrats' war was ending right before the election, that October surprise ended up getting undone. The war did keep going, and anybody who was anti-war in the country really did have no reason at all to vote for a Democrat. The racist right-wing guy peeled off 13% of the Democratic vote on the other side of the Democratic coalition. And so, yes, the Republican, Richard Nixon, won. It worked. Richard Nixon got elected, barely. Squeaked by, but he won, in part on the basis of the idea that he was the guy who knew how to end the war, not those dumb Democrats. And, of course, Nixon did not know how to end the war. He sure knew how to keep it going, but he didn't know how to end it. He didn't have a plan. And instead of the war ending on Halloween in 1968, the war went on for 5 more years while he was president, in which time more than 15,000 Americans were killed, as were untold numbers of Vietnamese. So that happened. That actually happened. And now, in 2013, what are we supposed to do with that information? LBJ is dead. Nixon is dead. Hubert Humphrey is dead. George Wallace is dead. 15,000 Americans are dead who otherwise would not have been because of what happened. All the Vietnamese who died. How does this get made right? It cannot be made right in the most basic sense that the people who died needlessly because of this duplicitous political decision cannot be brought back from the dead. You also can't get revenge. You can't indict Nixon's ghost. But you can't refuse to let him get away with it again. You can't make sure it is part of the way that we at least tell his history and the history of that war and the history of modern American politics. You have to include it in the history, both so nobody gets away with it in the long run the way he did in the short run, but also so we don't do it again. So we at least know something like this is possible. So we at least don't dismiss this kind of possibility as some conspiracy theory bit of nonsense. So we at least know there is precedent, modern precedent, for this particular kind of craven evil.
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. We do not give up. Expect surprises. Subscribe.